This is one of the sources that I will be using for my research paper. It is an essay by Anthony Badger posted on the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History website. Anthony Badger is a British historian who specializes in post-World War II Southern American political history. The purpose of this source is to showcase the different and differing lenses the civil rights movement was looked through, such as that of President Jimmy Carter. Alright, and what can this source better help us understand? Well, we're going to begin by discussing how this source better gives us improves our understanding of events happening around this time. He provides firsthand experiences from those like Jimmy Carter, and that gives us context as Jimmy Carter not only having firsthand experience, but also, being a president and having that perspective as well as being the leader of the nation. Having lived and experienced this type of segregation, Jimmy Carter in this text actually gives credit to this movement for his own election and says that the civil rights movement changed the South. He even goes on to talk and acknowledge a classic narrative of the civil rights movement. And he also sets up to challenge it. And he starts with here, his first challenge. Some historians argue that the economic modernization of the South made racial change inevitable. That can affect the narrative, because if something is already inevitable, it makes your strides towards it kind of futile if it was going to happen eventually. At the beginning, at the top of this first paragraph, he talks about how historians have criticized top-down historiography, and he actually comes in support of bottom-up historiography and discusses how the movement couldn't have been done without the local people. And then he goes on to list the important organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and SCLC, the Christian Leadership Conference, and acknowledges that without people and those people coming together to be a force, this would not have been possible. He discusses criticisms of King, such as the criticism of many historians criticizing King for his centrality of the nonviolent protests. And I think that has a lot to do with the narrative that is told. If King was out here preaching violence, or at least self-defense, he wouldn't be such an icon. He wouldn't be such a hero, and we wouldn't have a day celebrating him. It's the fact that he was nonviolent, that he was passive, and that he was peaceful that spread across Americans and was seen to them as non-threatening in some cases. Another key thing about this essay that stood out to me was its ability to include other nationwide events that were happening at the same time. So it gives us a better context of the United States in the 1950s till the 1970s and 80s, because we tend to think of history as linear and things happening right after the other instead of things all happening at the same time. So in this essay, he speaks about McCarthyism and how that affected the movement. And he says this era of the movement, however, was brought to a halt by McCarthyism, the civil rights movement that emerged after 1955 was a church-based, cross-class movement that stressed legalistic civil rights. Only belatedly after 1965 that did King and other leaders acknowledge the failure of the movement to address persistent realities of poverty and economic discrimination. So he includes how the context affected the movement and how that made the movement change, and how when the movement changes like that, then the perception of the movement changes, and that changes our narrative. And I think that this source, it ties it all together. It brings the skeleton of what students need to do to be better at historiography. Ask the right questions. Question the dominant narrative. Question historical memory. And these are all things that influence historical memory. We are getting different perspectives. We're getting perspective of former President Jimmy Carter. We're getting perspective of Anthony, because he's British. He's not even American. So, we can kind of tell how that influences his opinion on things. We're getting the perspective of blacks in the South. We're getting a bottom-up historiography instead of the top-down historiography. So this source is providing so much, not to mention how it provides context and does not neglect to mention the student organizations as well as the black general organizations like the NAACP. So I definitely think that this source is great for not only my research paper but also my historiography essay. So I think this source accomplishes what it sets out to do. It provides different perspectives as well as complicating what we believe to be the common narrative. It criticizes as well as acknowledges accomplishments. It's fair. It provides context. It shows the different lenses in which this movement was looked through and how that affected our narrative and the problems with those narratives.